So thanks for the intro. I am the Migration Program Manager at BSC, so responsible for Motus and the Long-Point Bird Observatory. Motus, when we originally designed it, we were adamant it wasn't going to be an acronym, and Motus essentially is just Latin and Greek for movement. And as you'll see, the whole system is revolved around movement. So the holy grail, well, why we're banding birds and for bird researchers in general, is to know everything about every bird at all times. And that's sort of, every time you hear a talk talking about movements or tracking technologies, it's just about that simple goal of knowing everything about every bird. In the case of a black-coated blue warbler, that means we want to know when and where it's breeding, every stop in between their migration, and when they're, where and when they're overwintering. And then also we can get so selfish as to, well, we want to know exactly when they're migrating and how fast it takes them and what the weather conditions were like during each of those flights. And we're getting there. So tracking technologies, we're gonna, at one point or another, probably throughout the weekend, we'll talk about all of them. There are many different tools that we use to examine birds. And one thing I would like to get put sort of right on the get-go is that I view these strongly as they're all cooperative technologies. There's quite often you'll get a competitive tone. Well, geolocators are better than GPS or satellite. They're all cooperative technologies and work very well together to answer different suites of questions. Next to banding or ringing, the oldest technology is radio telemetry, but it's been recently sort of breathed new life due to just as everything's a technological advance. So Motus is based on automated radio telemetry, specifically digital code. So the tags we use are just your standard radio tags that most people would have some familiarity with. And analog tags will distribute a signal on a different frequency. So if you have 10 different animals, you'll have 10 different frequencies. The difference with Motus tags or nano tags is that they all work on the same frequency. So we can have thousands of tags all operating on the same frequency, so that if you have researchers in West Virginia and researchers in Florida using the same frequency, as the animals move back and forth between those two areas, the same equipment can detect those tags. Currently, nano tags are the smallest tracking device that you can put. Currently, they're 0.2 grams, which allows you to put them on monarch butterflies and darner dragonflies, and we're working up to hummingbirds. But putting them on small silver-haired bats or black-coated blue warblers is well below the sort of the established guideline of 3 or 5% of the animal's body weight. And then each of the stations, which typically comprise a receiver, a computer, some kind of a tower, which could be a building or a tree, and antennas, just record data and listen for these tags 24/7. And each antenna on any station can detect animals anywhere between 15 and 20 kilometers. The conservative estimate's 10, but we've had simultaneous detections of much greater than that between two towers. And then they give you a very high temporal or geographic precision, depending on your scale of what you want to consider high geographic precision. The tags will repeat, some of them every 5 seconds, or some of them up to every 30 seconds. So every single repeat, you get an update on the position and activity of that. So these are just some examples of different stations around the hemisphere. This is in the Andes of Colombia, this is in southern Ontario near Longpoint, and this is on the coast of Nova Scotia. This is a bamboo pole, this is the top of a Met tower, and then these are sort of self-standing structures. So we put them pretty much everywhere. The sort of starting foundation for this work began at Longpoint in 2008 to 2010 for some of my masters and other work. And we set up an array of stations. This is Longpoint, Ontario, and just north of here on Lake Erie. We set up an array of stations at most of the main banding stations for the Longpoint Bird Observatory at the tip, and Old Cut. We have another station here. But essentially, this array allowed us to tag birds at the tip or Old Cut, detect their movements back and forth up and down the point, when they moved to the mainland, if they did, and another site on the mainland allowed us to determine when they actually left. And we're just going to dig into these a little bit. So over the course of those few years, we tagged about 300 individuals for a number of different species, and if you're interested in digging into the details a bit more, you could look at any of these publications, and I'd be happy to discuss them more. But I'm going to use it as a case study to get into. That's fine. And then within each panel, we have signal strength for a tag. So when a bird is active, signal strength is highly variable. You'll get really high, lots of peaks and valleys. And when a bird is inactive, the signal strength will just be relatively flat. So this is a life history of a black-throated blue warbler at Long Point. It was tagged just after noon. And then you'll see there's lots of variability in the signal strength, so it was feeding. And then this is sunset, and you'll notice the tag strength just sort of becomes a bit more mute, so the bird's asleep. Until just before sunrise, the bird wakes up again, is active, and then just after midnight, 2 days later, you see this little peak here, and then it decides, so I'm going to fly, and that's its flight, going from site A to site B to site C. And if you zoom in on that flight just after midnight to here, this is exactly what it looks like. This little peak, the bird taking flight, flying away from that one station, which is on the mainland, crossing the other tower, and I'll show you on the map, and then flying out over Lake Erie. So we've tracked that flight, both the decision to depart, which happened just about 10 minutes after midnight, to the last time we detected its flight from Long Point at about 0. So this is a bird that was on the mainland, and basically that data depicts its entire sort of life history on the farm there. This is actually David O'Kine's house, where that bird was tagged, wherever David is. Crossed the BSC fence, and then went out over Lake Erie. So these are direct nocturnal departures. I'm not going to get into the details of that actual data. Another example is the ability to detect movements at relatively fine scales. So this is an individual that was tagged at the tip of Long Point. It stayed there for about 3 days, and then in the middle of the night, 2 in the morning, moved to the base of Long Point, where it stayed for another 2 or 3 days, and then its final migratory departure. This is a zoom in of the movement, very precise, happened about 2:45, and then it got to the base of Long Point about 2 hours later. What happened in between, we don't quite know. It may have actually gone to the mainland and then flown back, and then its final migratory. So this individual was an adult female, if you're curious. So it allows us to scale up from, our traditional scale of our banding site, or even a lot of radio telemetries are limited to 1 or 2 kilometers, to be able to examine movement at a larger spatial scale. In this case, the tower is covering an area of about 800 square kilometers. And just as a point of order, a lot of these movements, we call them landscape scale movements, usually sometimes in orders of 30 kilometers. Many of the birds tagged at the tip moved back to the mainland for a period. And they all happened at night as well, which is fascinating. So as I said, it's allowed us to scale up from sort of the traditional site or understanding of stopover ecology to a much broader landscape scale, one that the birds are probably already operating, or really operating at. And even at a scale at this level, 800 square kilometers, we felt that maybe we were still just at the lower tier of that, of being able to see what the birds are actually doing. So that's sort of the start of this idea that happened at Long Point. And all during that time we realized, well, we're not alone. We're not the only one using radio telemetry. We're not the only ones using automated radio telemetry. There's projects all over the world using similar technologies. What if we were all talking to each other? And that was when you wanted to be ready. So Acadia University developed the SensorGnome, which is essentially just a do-it-yourself receiver that brought down the price from about 10 grand to $1,000 or $2,000. And then suddenly the world wasn't so big. You could deploy a lot of stations. And it's all do-it-yourself. You can buy all the components online and build it yourself, or you can get someone to build it for you. Since the development of the SensorGnome, the commercial units, big surprise, have come down in price. So you can either do it yourself with SensorGnomes or buy commercial units. There's pros and cons to. So the first broad-scale implementation of a Motus-like coordinated automated telemetry network was done in 2013 with multiple partners on the East Coast. So in 2013, they had 40 stations across about half a dozen different collaborators, and they tagged 600 individuals of everything you could imagine: passerines, storm petrels, gulls, some herring gulls and blackback gulls, because they are big, they can handle big tags. There's still blackback gulls with tags that are active that were tagged in 2013, flying around being detected by the towers. Common terns, and then Ipswich sparrows. And so it was a great sort of case study for that broad-scale collaboration effort. And I'm going to zoom in on 2 examples of this. And the first one is the black-bill warbler. And just as an example of the, cooperative nature, I had a better word and I just lost it earlier on, but of the technologies. The geolocator data will give you this. This is the study we did. It was just released last year on blackpoll warblers. And it'll tell you, yes, the blackpoll was in this region for that time, and then it flew across the ocean during those few days, and then we're in these big blobs. But what's happening within these big blobs? And that's where this kind of technology can really insight. So if we examine one of those blobs, this is sort of the decisions that birds migrating from Nova Scotia through the Gulf of Maine to Cape Cod have to make. They can choose, in the case this is for Ipswich sparrows, but they can choose to go around the Bay of Fundy in the Gulf of Maine, they can choose to go across, or they can decide to skip it entirely and go right to the East Coast. But each of those options presents itself with a different number of risks that it has to decide upon. So a signal, if they go across, it's a single flight, high fuel cost, but navigation risk if you don't get it right or if the winds change, or if you have to do it in multiple flights. It's longer, but they're less fuel per flight, but that's the same way that the merlins go, and it's the same way that the sharpshins go, so there's a high predation risk. And there's consequence to making the wrong decision, a very real consequence. Another benefit, it's morbid, but a benefit of radiotelemetry as well is that you can know mortality rates when a bird dies. Most of the time you can find it. In this case, this blackpoll was pegged by a merlin, and we only knew it because we could find it. So just a rehash of what the array looks like in the 20 these flights in a bit more detail, we can learn that sort of the example that I gave you from Long Point, we were dealing at a fairly small scale, 800 square kilometers. When we zoom it up to many thousands of square kilometers, we're learning stopover ecology of animals on a very different level. So this blackpoll warbler canso, this is the top of Nova Scotia, and at the bottom this is latitude. This is about halfway down Nova Scotia. And this is the life history of a blackpoll warbler in Nova Scotia from September 16th when it was tagged all the way until its final flight over the Atlantic on October 26th. So 6 weeks of an individual's stopover or migratory preparation in Nova Scotia. So it stayed in Canso for about a week, and then it flew down. It's about 50 kilometers, another 50 kilometers, back up 50 kilometers, 300 kilometer flight over a period of about a week down to Prospect. What the heck, I'm going to go back up 100 kilometers to Taylor's Head, and then down to Kingsville, which is about halfway through Nova Scotia before its final flight. So we thought we were getting close to the scale that birds operate at Long Point. Turns out we were way off by orders of magnitude, but this also varies obviously by species and the landscape that you're in. And then consequently, this is its final days, and its final flight was flying south over the Atlantic. So this is probably the 6-week preparation for a cross-Atlantic flight to South America. And just to put it into perspective, this is that blackpoll warbler's journey over 6 weeks, comprising many thousands of individual records. So when you break down the data, similar to the black-toed blue warbler data I showed you, for certain periods we knew when that bird was sleeping, when it was eating, when it decided to fly, and where it decided to fly to. There's no more in the bird world. And it turns out that what decisions these blackpoll warblers make, whether they take the overland route or whether they take more risky flights, is related to their age, where the adults are more navigationally better and probably selected that way, will take the more risky flights over the Gulf of Maine, whereas the young tend to fly around. And you can check it out in the paper if you're interested. So another example, hello. Another similar example is that of Ipswich sparrow, which breed exclusively on Sable Island. They're a subspecies of the Savannah sparrow. So islands are great for this kind of technology because it limits where birds can go and where you need to set up equipment. And that's no short flight. And also, and this is just sort of the same slide I showed you before, that it's very age dependent what the birds will do, so we can start to dig into their demographics and what's actually driving the decisions and selection between young and adults and the different decisions. So that was the development of Motus over a number of years. And in 2014, we received a large grant from the Canada Foundation for Innovation with additional support from Environment Canada to get things off the ground. And it was an infrastructure to build hemispheric network starting in Ontario and the East Coast. So this is what the array looked like in 2015, combining all projects from across the hemisphere. It's easy to miss little yellow dots here in Colombia that are very important. The Gulf starting to light up, a project in Alaska, and then there's stations in the high Arctic above the map that you can't see as well. And so as of 2015, last year we had 50 research projects with over 150 collaborators. And since 2013, we've tagged 5,000 animals. It's actually 64 species, including 8 species of bat from pretty much every taxon. And what the rest of my talk is going to be, and 100 million detections is what that translates to. I'm going to go through just some case studies of projects that I'm most personally involved in, or Bird Studies Canada is most involved in, to show you some more breadth of the data and the possibilities, and sort of where we're heading. So similarly to the earlier work that I showed you at Long Point and on the East Coast, some work we're doing with Western, again from Long Point, we knew where they were going when we had Long Point covered, but now we have all of Southern Ontario covered, so we can expand up to that next scale. It's down to a question of migratory orientation, so you can forget about the Emlyn funnel and build up to a different pair, or you can use local scale orientation to figure out the decision the bird's making on the ground, but then scale up and figure out exactly where they actually ended up. Myrtles and maggies are sort of a pseudo-boreal migrant that will breed all across northern Canada, and similarly their orientation would suggest that heading north, and many of them going straight up the Bruce Peninsula, which is there. But when you look at black-throated blue warbler, which are not a boreal migrant, they're a St. Lawrence, Great Lakes deciduous forest breeder. In Ontario, Algonquin Park here is probably the hotbed of their activity, and you can tell just from the flight tracks of them, they've got an easterly kick, they've got a different orientation that will directly link, that can directly link sort of breeding origins to migration hotspots, and this corresponds as well to stable isotope work, or could be used as priors to inform stable isotope work at a more broad scale, which show us this flight all the way up to the top of Bruce Peninsula, about 600 kilometers. And then at 8:15, its final detection at the north end of the Bruce Peninsula. So there we have the entire life history, exact information on its departure time, and the entire flight. So we can start to apply information like this to bigger conservation questions, and without getting political, offshore wind farms is a big one on the Great Lakes. Do they cross the lakes, or do they go around them, which have obvious implications for the siting of wind farms? And then from a bird perspective, how are they navigating and where are they going as well across those lakes? So first, an example of bank swallows, and I don't think that this animation might not work, so I'll show you at the end, but we'll give it a try. And if not, I'll just show you a static version of it. No, I'm not going to bother. But this is a static shot of what bank swallows do in southern Ontario during 1 week. So this is this colony here. And they regularly migrate, move daily from their colony to Long Point, large marshes, and back and forth on a daily basis. But we also have these forays into the province and down the coast, and a lot of movement down and across in the Western Basin. And then likewise, birds tagged near Toronto also make its way down to Long Point, which is becoming to be learned as a hotbed for bank swallows. Colonies and migration, like roosting colonies, probably upwards of 500,000 late July. And then likewise, a similar bank swallow study where they're tagged in Sackville, Nova Scotia. Lots of more local movements, not using the landscape nearly as much as the Ontario birds. And then these are their final migratory flights in mid-August down the East Coast, using towers on at least half a dozen different. But when we return to the bat question, this is a gorgeous hoary bat. There's the antenna. And silver-haired bats, red bats, these are all migratory tree bats that are, you could call them long-distance migrants, but they're probably more related to our temperate migrants, moving from the boreal forest to the southern states. Red bats will overwinter where they can. Tree bats are the ones that are most at risk from being hit by turbines. Previous work we did at Long Point in that first study I showed that probably we inferred that half of the bats probably cross the lake where the other half might go around, but we didn't have towers on the other side of the lake. So this year year, last year, I set up 2 towers on the south side of the lake. And this fall, we're planning to ring the entire south shore of the lake. And then we tagged about 100 bats at Long Point. They cross the lake, and it turns out they do. So this is silver-haired bats, and every age and sex combination for silver-haired bats actively cross across Lake Erie, particularly from the Long Point to Presqu'île area. And guess where there's a plotted wind turn proposal? Similarly for red bat, although they're more local, do lots of forays locally, but also cross. And the hoary bats did something different. And this is just an example of Myotis lucifugus, which is the little brown bat, which is critically endangered across most of its range now due to white nose. But there's still these remnant populations in smaller colonies. So this is a colony Long Point and the local distribution of their movements post-breeding, including some migratory ones. But they're a resident, they didn't cross the lake. So, enough about bats. Another project that we're working on heavily has to do with Arctic breeding shorebirds, and this is led primarily by Environment Canada with a lot of collaborators. And I'm going to speak mostly just its remoteness off the beaten track. It houses hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of shorebirds every year. And it's a critical staging area. There's probably 5,000 white rumps in this picture. It's one of the biggest wetlands in the world. It's one big mud flat for hundreds of kilometers along the coastline, and critical staging areas for red knots, and then also Hudsonian godwits, white rump sandpipers, and semi-palmated sandpipers. And then there's the James Bay. The primary staging area is this sort of southern tier of James Bay. So in 2013, we tagged birds here at Long Ridge just to see if they would be detected by that array I showed you in the East Coast, and it turned out they did. And then starting in 2014, we set up more stations along the coast and started tagging shorebirds, so we can learn not just about how long they're staying on James Bay, but where are they staying on James Bay? Are they moving between sites? Are they staying at one site? How long does it take them to refuel, and when do they leave? And the data is quite neat. This is just a really rough plot, but each of these lines is a different species, mostly semi-palmated and white rump sandpipers from one location at Long Ridge, but we know that they were captured on one day, and then overall the birds are staying for up to 2 weeks, sometimes 3 weeks, and we can start to work into individual variation in those individuals. So we get these life histories, not just for the land birds, but we're getting them for shorebirds in completely different environments. And the top graph just shows the abundance of shorebirds on James Bay during these different peak times. And this is an example of a semi-palmated sandpiper, its life history on James Bay, tagged at Little Squamish, where it stayed for 3 weeks before its migratory flight. Squamish is north of Natishi, so this is its migratory flight south down the coast. And then a different example, so that's a bird that stayed put. And a different example of a bird that was tagged at Long Ridge Point, again north to south, stayed there for about a week, moved to the Squamish for a week, down to Wash, which is at the southern end of James Bay, and stayed there for 2 weeks before it left. So we're getting contrasting use of the James Bay coastline with semi-palmated sandpipers. And when you start to tease together the data hemispherically, you can build even stronger maps. Now these are actually of red knots, and these are red knots that were tagged in Delaware Bay. And when the presentation here is over, I'll show you some examples online, and we can actually watch them flying. But essentially what we see here is a core of birds tagged in Delaware Bay. Their spring migration, and then they were lost. This is their spring migration. This bird here is its first fall migration, and then this is what I call the James Bay Exodus. So all of the birds that were tagged in Delaware Bay, large majority of them ended up in James Bay staging, and then that's the James Bay Exodus to the coastline before they migrate farther south, many of them eventually on the way to Terra del Fuego. The northern coast of Colombia is another one of these overlooked, incredibly important stopover spots, especially for migratory thrushes. Gray-cheeked thrushes, they're one of my favorites, and they probably hold a special place in many of your hearts. They don't joke around. Like Central America is kind of a joke to them. Why would you go all the way around when you can just fly over the Caribbean Sea and the Gulf of Mexico? So they fatten up in North Colombia before taking that big flight, and that's what that is on. And similarly, we're getting these life histories for overwintering habitats, and all this data represents the similar data that I showed you for the black-throated blue warblers, but knowing exactly where they are in the landscape and how long they're staying before they embark on their migratory flights, and we know exactly when they leave as well. So this is an example of migratory flights at a hemispheric level from Swainson's thrush tagged at that site near Bogota, and then the gray-cheeked thrushes leaving from northern Colombia being detected. The Swainsons are quite broadly distributed, but all of the gray-cheeked thrushes ended up going through, the majority of them, through the Mississippi Valley in Indiana before splitting to, that's Churchill, probably close to the breeding grounds, and many of them split heading east as well. I can get into all kinds of details, but it's going to be easier to do so when I show you the animations of these flights. It's important to realize with the gray-cheeked thrushes, that's a hemispheric detection rate of 40%. So 40% of the birds that we tagged in Colombia were redetected elsewhere in North America, most of them in Indiana. We got band recoveries for many of those birds. So this is what Motus looks like in this year. 2016, 2017. We have collaborators in Europe. This is on Helgoland. Everybody knows Helgoland. And then this is Lake Constance in Switzerland, which is going to have a station working this year. There's expansion going on in French Guiana, and I'll talk to you briefly about the Gulf of Mexico and the Panama Gateway, which is what we're calling it. And there's obvious areas for expansion that are a priority to us, particularly this Pacific Flyway and the Neotropics, and the Panama Gateway is our push into both areas. So if we look closer, this is what's going on right now. I have a team in Panama setting up towers, and then there's teams flying out tomorrow to go and start to do some of this Gulf of Mexico work. The red dots are stations that are already in play, and then the pink dots here in Louisiana will hopefully be up and running by May sometime. The average departure date for gray-cheeked thrushes in Colombia, where we're going to tag about 100 there, is about May 6th. So we're working right up against the clock to try and get the Gulf of Mexico up and running before those birds depart, because if they leave here May 6th, they're going to be there May 8th. And then there's some other projects. And then the Panama Gateway is an interesting, well, as everybody knows, an incredibly important migratory spot, and just because of the geography, a very easy spot to put up a fence. So starting this week, all these stations will be operational and they're all online. And it will essentially create a wall between North and South America for any trans-hemispheric migrants will have to cross that border at some point. So thank you very much, and I don't know if you want to do questions, or I can show you a couple of maps first and then do questions.
Yes.